everybody, and welcome to the show. We have an epic journey on hand tonight. We are welcoming back Mr. Travis Shortt, who is here to continue to educate us on this crazy Mothman history and the phenomena that is still ongoing to this day. Hey everybody, and welcome to the Paranormal Portal. I'm your host, Brent Thomas. Thank you so much for joining us today. We've got an epic show ahead, but just remember, if any of you have experiences you'd like to share, I'd love to hear from you. You can either email me at paranormalportalradio@gmail.com or head over to paranormalportal.net. Scroll down and find the button that says Interview Me, and that'll allow you to look at a calendar of possible times and dates and find a date that works for you. Love to hear your stories, so definitely get in touch with me. So without further ado, let's dive into it. Welcome to the show, Travis. Thanks for coming back, brother. It's great to have you here.
It is my pleasure, and as always, love being on your show. Love being on any show where I get to talk about Mothman, but yours is always fun because there's, the chemistry, the interaction, the insightful questions that you have. It's always fun.
Well, thank you for being here. So we kind of laid a good groundwork the last time you were here, and so let's pick it up from there. Can you kind of summarize where we're at this point in the journey?
Yeah. So, the Mothman, the entire story just fascinates people all over the country and literally all over the world. I think I mentioned last time during the show, if you want something really fun to do in the month of September, make your way to the Mothman Festival there in Point Pleasant, and you will meet people from literally every corner of the world. When we were going and I was doing my presentation and we were screening the film and things like that, we met people from Australia. We met people from Ireland and Scotland and Japan and, all over the U.S. And it was just absolutely, fascinating to see how many people fell in love with this story. That is, there's history involved, there's tragedy involved, there's the paranormal, the potential of, cryptids and the potential of UFOs and men in black and all of these elements that, what a lot of individuals in the field have now started referring to as high strangeness. And that was a term that I had used decades ago, and now it started becoming even more and more part of the nomenclature in this field, because it really does. It's one of those things. It really does kind of describe it the best. It's just a lot of weird stuff going on, and no explanation for it. And I think I said in the last interview, that's one of the things I love about this field is, and I don't consider myself a cryptozoologist. I don't consider myself even a paranormal investigator. I'm more of a Fortean researcher. I like these interesting topics that pop up from time to time. I get really interested in. Mothman was one of those. UFOs, extraterrestrials, men in black, that's been one. Demonic possession, the occult, that's another area that I love to dabble in and research and look at how it's impacting our world and impacting our society and impacting the field that you and I are part of. Both are this Fortean research, paranormal investigation, and in broadcast media, how that we're talking about it, how that we're presenting it. Who are we giving a voice to talk about these things? So every time I get the invitation to come on a show, I'm very grateful that I'm, obviously considered somebody that people want to hear talk about Mothman. So I appreciate the invitation to come and open and expound on the many mysteries of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and the Mothman. And I guess probably the best thing to do by way of introduction for individuals, and I honestly can't imagine anyone who doesn't know a little bit about Mothman by this point.
Sure.
Yeah. But just a real quick kind of thumbnail sketch introduction into what we'll be talking about. So in November 15th, 1966, two teenage couples, in the Millettes of the Scarberries, were in the TNT area, which is just north of Point Pleasant, West Virginia. The TNT area is the former McClintock Wildlife Preserve, and it had been an arsenal storage facility during World War II. And we can get into that a little bit later because there's some interesting stuff about that, about the connection there with Mothman, or potentially with Mothman. So they were out there one night, hot rod racing. It's one of the only straight stretches of road that you're going to find pretty much on all of the state of West Virginia, thus the John Denver song, Country Roads. If you ever listen to that song and you really want to know what it is about, it's a road figure eights, basically, because mountain roads are really curvy. There aren't a whole lot of straight ones.
Sure.
But this area had a straight stretch of road that ran for a couple miles. And that's where the teenagers would go and hot rod race. And they were out there one night, and they saw something while they were there. And it was off in the field at the North Power Plant. There was a North Power Plant, a South Power Plant in the TNT area. And that was back from the days of it being a government installation. And they saw what Linda Scarberry described later in police reports as a tall, muscular man, pale, ashen in color, red glowing eyes, 7 to 9 feet tall was their estimation, and had what looked like angel wings protruding out of its back. Oh. And they immediately got in their car. It was 57 Chevy, and they started racing back to Point Pleasant, doing in excess of 100 miles an hour, according to their report and the police report. Mm. And this winged entity was following them in flight, and it was scratching at Rogers' 57 Chevy, which honestly, other than the collapse of the bridge, is really one of the biggest travesties to come out of this story as far as I'm concerned, is that this entity that faced the 1957 Chevy.
Yeah, no kidding.
That's one of my favorite classic cars. But so that was November 15th, 1966, and that set off what would become a 13-month hotspot of sightings across this area of West Virginia, multiple counties. There were over 100 eyewitness reports, and by very, very solid, very, very respected community individuals, police officers, lawyers, doctors, teachers, were seeing this winged entity all over Mason County, West Virginia, and the surrounding areas, until December 15th of 1967. And that is the day that really kind of thrust the Mothman into pop culture, and that was the day that the Silver Bridge collapsed. And something I'd like to get into tonight is kind of this timeline of historic tragedies that have plagued the Point Pleasant area, the Ohio Valley there in West Virginia, and neighboring counties, and a lot of it researchers and investigators have tied back to Mothman and then an original curse that was placed by Chief Cornstalk, who was chief of the Logan tribe there in what is now West Virginia, back during the pre-colonial days and before the Revolutionary War in the U.S. But it's just a fascinating story as we look at all of these elements that come together, and of course, the running consensus is that the Mothman either caused the collapse of the bridge, he was there to warn about the collapse of the bridge, maybe he was the death angel that was there to collect the souls of the people that were going to be dying in the collapse of the bridge. And so there's been all of these connections that people have tried to make to Mothman. And of course, depending on who you talk to, the majority of people will tell you that Mothman was never seen in Point Pleasant again. There are a few individuals that I have talked to that say, yes, there have been other sightings. Yes, they've seen him. Yes, he continues to be spotted every now and then there in the area. But it's a fascinating concept. As I said, there's the paranormal, there's the historical, there's the structural engineering side of things when you get to looking at the bridge and what actually caused the collapse, and the lives that were affected.
It's kind of interesting, the number of personalities or attributes that the Mothman is given, because it's oftentimes linked to this higher intelligence, this more guiding I mean, I don't know. You know what I mean? Like an ethereal being that's looking out for the best interest of mankind, like with Mothman prophecies. But then there's also stories like the 57 Chevy, where it's like this, almost like a mindless creature, you know? And it's like, that's where I have trouble. It's like, how do you reconcile what this thing is, you know?
Well, and I, I don't know if we ever will be able to reconcile what this entity is. I think I said, I know I've said it many times in interviews, and if I repeat myself, I apologize.
No, not at all.
But that's one of the interesting things for me when myself and Charlie McCracken and Matthew Fleming, we were the three that were really involved in the production of Darkwings, the Mothman Chronicle. Yes, Darkwings, almost the Mothman Prophecies. No, Darkwings, the Mothman Chronicles. We were the ones that came together to put that film together.
Right. And
it was interesting because when we went into Point Pleasant, Charlie kind of went in with a very open mind. He obviously people had seen some things, 100 eyewitnesses accounts. Many of those accounts take place at the same time, so it wasn't like they were corroborating stories. These things were happening in multiple locations throughout this area there in Point Pleasant and the surrounding communities, the surrounding counties, and individuals, if they're not familiar with the town of Point Pleasant, and especially back in the 1960s, it's very rural. I mean, literally think Mayberry and Andy Griffith,
right?
And that's the type of town. And so it's not like, you have cell phones or internet and people are going, ooh, let's put this hoax together. I'm going to say I'm seeing this. You say you're seeing it. It wasn't working like that. These were different people, unrelated, not having any communication with each other, and they were all reporting the same kind of things at the same time at different locations, sometimes miles and miles apart. And there were, as you mentioned, how do you reconcile certain things? There were, well, I use the term discrepancy, but that automatically makes people think, well, they're lying, but it's not that. It's that there were slight differences in every eyewitness account that came in. The height would vary. It never really dropped below 7 feet, and it never went really above 9 feet. So it was this 2-foot kind of window of measurement that people had.
Right.
The color of the entity would sometimes change. Sometimes it was dark gray. Sometimes it was ashen pale, looking like Linda Scarberry. Sometimes it was almost black. Sometimes it had like a cloak or a tunic kind of clothing. Sometimes it appeared to have no clothing at all. But the consistencies that were always there were red glowing eyes and these huge wings coming out of its back.
Yeah. Yep.
And so those were consistent accounts from all of these eyewitnesses. And so the way, I'm not saying I'm explaining the discrepancies away, but the one thing that makes sense in my mind is that there was not a Mothman, but there were Moth people, if you will. There were multiple winged entities that were appearing, manifesting, whatever words you want to use, at the same time in multiple locations. So people were seeing slightly different things. So, the entity that the Scarberries saw that was flying after them and scratching at the 57 Chevy is, may not have been exhibiting the same attributes, the same traits, if you will, as another entity that was being seen.
Right.
And then, I always try to joke with people. I said, we always think about these types of sightings from our perspective, from our worldview. I mean, imagine what Mothman might have been thinking when he saw these 4 teenagers and a 57 Chevy.
Yeah.
How did that, and what was his perspective?
Yeah, that's true.
What did he see? If he is an intelligent higher being, what was he seeing? If he's more of an animal, more of a beast, kind of a base, less than evolved type of entity, was he scared? Was he angry? Was he attacking? So we have to be very careful in, I think, all of these situations, whether it's Mothman, extraterrestrials, intelligent hauntings, I think we have to be careful that we're not always projecting our biases, our theories,
good point,
our beliefs onto the scenario.
Yeah, that's a great take for sure. Yeah. So let's talk about the history now and the chief that you were mentioning, because I think that's fascinating that it goes back so far.
It does. It was really interesting for us. So historically, at the time that West Virginia was kind of being settled, West Virginia, parts of Ohio, parts of Kentucky, parts of Tennessee, and parts of Virginia it was all the same land mass. Wasn't the way it looks on the maps today. There were no state lines outlining where everything was. These were all really considered part of the same territory. Mm-hmm. And there was a westward migration at this time in the 1770s. People from what is Virginia proper, moving westward and trying to settle lands and things like that. And there was an outpost that was established by these American settlers, and it was called Camp Point Pleasant. And the name comes from their situation at the joining of the Kanawha and the Ohio River. It's a land point there, so this is where they set up camp. This is where they were trying to, make a settlement. Later, of course, became the town of Point Pleasant. There are differing stories historically when we get to this particular part, because the one part that is absolutely accurate, and we found it very fascinating and very interesting, is that there was a battle that took place at Camp Point Pleasant called the Battle of Point Pleasant, but it was a part of a bigger battle, which was Lord Dunmore's War. And Lord Dunmore was actually Governor Murray, the governor of Virginia, but his British title was Lord Dunmore. Okay. And he had been trying to stop the westward migration, and there was this tension that was building. That was the reason he was trying to stop the migration westward, because there was tension building between some of the hostile Native American tribes, the indigenous tribes, and these westward moving settlers. So what happened was there ended up being a battle between the Native Americans and the settlers there at Camp Point Pleasant. And depending on the two versions, Chief Cornstalk, who was, again, I said chief of I said Logan tribe, I'm very sorry, chief of the Mingo tribe. I just corrected myself. Okay. Forgive me on the memories. I did have 2 strokes back in March, so I'm still trying to exercise the brain.
You're doing great.
A little more clear when we're talking about it, but he was actually chief of the Mingo tribe. I'm sorry about that.
Gotcha.
And he was either, depending on which story, he was either friendly with these settlers, and he and his son, Elenipsico, were staying with them, or he was actually part of the onslaught of attacks that were raging against the settlers. So there's 2 kind of differing stories there. But what happened was there were 2 settlers that were murdered by the hostile tribes. And then, as I said, either Cornstalk and Elenipsico were already living at Camp Point Pleasant and had been taken in, or they were captured and were brought there by force. And that's where the story gets a little iffy. And then, as I said, there's another side of the story that talks about how that Cornstalk was actually in battle with the settlers. Either way, what ends up happening is Cornstalk ends up being killed. One version of the story that says when they were inside the camp that the white settlers became enraged about the murder of the other settlers, so that they then turned and killed Cornstalk and his son out of revenge. The other version of the story talks about how that Cornstalk was actually attacking Camp Point Pleasant and was killed in the battle. But where the stories become similar is that regardless of how Cornstalk's death came about, what is said is that he uttered a curse on the land that it would never find any form of peace, that it would always have tragedy and turmoil and death and bloodshed. So all of that took place in the 1770s. What we did find, this is very interesting, and especially for historians out there, that Lord Dunmore's War has now been declared by the Daughters of the American Revolution as the very first battle for independence in this country, predating any other battle leading up to the Revolutionary War. So there's a very interesting historical context here. We're dealing with something that has not just paranormal, supernatural, Fortean significance, but it actually has some very, very grounded historical significance for the founding of this country.
Yeah, no doubt.
Now, what happens then is if you go back and you look at what took place there with Cornstalk and Ellen Nipstico and their death in the town of Point Pleasant, and this curse that Cornstalk is said to have uttered. And then you start kind of trying to look at the tragedies that befell the town of Point Pleasant. You start getting a very interesting, very, very dark timeline of things that have transpired in this little town. Now, again, Point Pleasant is a town, at the time of the collapse of the bridge, around 5,000. It has a population of about 4,800 right now, so it hasn't changed a whole lot in the past 50, 60 years. But if you start looking at Point Pleasant, 1907, there was a coal mining disaster. It killed 310 miners. 1944, in June, 150 people killed when a tornado came through the tri-state area, and it ripped a path right through Point Pleasant.
Oh, no. Oh.
1967, the collapse of the Silver Bridge, 46 people. 1968, August, 35 people killed when Piedmont Airlines airplane crashes near the Kanawha Airport, just outside of Point Pleasant. 1970, November 14th, 75 people killed when Southern Airways DC-10 crashes into a mountain just outside of Point Pleasant near Huntington, West Virginia. 1976. In March, the town of Point Pleasant was rocked in the middle of the night when an explosion was heard at the Mason County Jail there in downtown Point Pleasant. Housed in the jail was a woman by the name of Harriet Fisk. She'd been arrested for the murder of her infant daughter. On March the 2nd, her husband came to visit her that night in the jail with a suitcase filled with explosives to kill himself and his wife.
Oh, my God.
Both Fisk and the wife were killed along with 3 law enforcement officers. What happened was he brought in the suitcase of dynamite. He had a shotgun under a trench coat. He sat the suitcase down, aimed the shotgun, and fired at the suitcase. It blew up the jail. It blew up himself. It blew up his wife. It blew up these 3 police officers. Now, what's interesting, again, tying this to the curse of Chief Cornstalk, is that the site of the Mason County Jail was the original burial site for Chief Cornstalk's remains upon his death.
Oh, my God. Wow.
These remains were exhumed and moved to their new location at Sewindowee Park, which is actually there at the joining of the Ohio and the Kanawha. Wow. In 1978, January, freight train derailed in Point Pleasant and dumped thousands of gallons of chemicals. The chemicals contaminated the town's water supply, and all of the wells had to be abandoned in the entire town. April 1978, tragedy struck again the town of St. Mary's, just north of Point Pleasant. 51 men were working on the Willow Island power plant. They were killed when their construction scaffolding collapsed.
Wow.
More startling was research and information that was discovered by Charlie McCracken while we were working on this project. He discovered there were recent images from FAA flight paths that show that Flight 77, which is the airplane on 9/11 that was flown into the Pentagon, this plane was flying west over Point Pleasant and was apparently overtaken and hijacked directly over the town of Point Pleasant before immediately changing course and flying back east and flying into the Pentagon.
Aye.
Yeah. It was just tragedy after tragedy after tragedy. And then, not even part of this timeline, again, goes back to the research that we were doing in the newspaper morgue office when we were there researching the collapse of the Silver Bridge. And we started looking at other non-related stories that were piquing our interest. And there was just an amazing and inordinate amount of death in this town. Hunting accidents, driving accidents, suicides, homicides. It literally is like the town was cursed.
Yeah, I know.
And so when you start taking all these things into consideration, and then you look at, all of a sudden, you've got Mothman, and like I said in the previous episode, Mothman wasn't the only thing that was taking place in Point Pleasant in the 60s, or West Virginia for that matter, in relation to Point Pleasant and several other sightings. You had Indrid Cold, who was appearing to Woodrow Derenberger. In Mineral Wells, West Virginia, you had the Flatwoods Monster, which was appearing to hunters and hikers in another part of West Virginia. And all of these are within, easable driving distance of one another. I started referring to it as the West Virginia Triangle, because they make this very crude triangle there in the heart of the state of West Virginia. Another interesting thing about the area where Point Pleasant is located is that the indigenous tribes, they would never settle there. They would go hunt there. They would use it as hunting grounds, but they wouldn't settle there in that area where that's why the settlers were able to actually settle it in the first place, because there were no tribes in that area.
Mm-hmm.
It was as if they sensed something about the area.
Sure. It's incredible that so much, and I realize that if you draw a geographical circle around any place, you're going to get a certain number of tragedies, a certain number of weird things happening. But to have all of them concentrated around such a small community, I think really does defy the odds when you think of the number of tragedies, the number of people killed in those tragedies. That's really, at the very least, that's a really profound mathematic anomaly.
It is. And, again, one of the tragedies that I forgot to mention, because we included it in the documentary, was the airplane crash that killed the Marshall football team. West Virginia University, not very far from the town of Point Pleasant. They were flying there. They were killed not far outside of Point Pleasant. The plane crashed. So it's just tragedy after tragedy after tragedy. But again, going back to what drew us to Point Pleasant was just how this little stubborn river town keeps bouncing back, and they keep moving forward. And it's the power of the human nature, the tenacity of the human spirit that we don't give up. 1967 to 2001, so 34 years later, they were able to get a statue of Mothman in downtown, and they launched the Mothman Festival in 2001. Right after 9/11, that was the very first festival that they held, and it has gone strong every year with the exception of 2020 during COVID. And it has brought people from all over the world to this tiny little town. And this tiny little town is now, world famous because of this tragedy of the Silver Bridge and this winged red-eyed entity known as Mothman.
Yeah. Now, again, getting to the Mothman itself, what do you think that, I know it's impossible to say with any kind of certainty, and I realize that it's a big ask, but do you feel that it's one thing or the other? Or, do you have, because you've chased all these stories, you've heard from all of these witnesses and people that are part of this community that was absolutely transformed by these events, but do you have a feeling about what it is or what you believe it could be?
Oh, that would be like a whole show in and of itself, man. That's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
It's not like that's the first time I've gotten asked that question. and I'll say this, I'm very upfront about it. If you go back and listen to some of my early interviews, starting in, I think 2005, 2004, 2005, when we started doing interviews about Mothman and the documentary film, a lot of what I tell you today is almost the total opposite of what I told you then, and that's not me being hypocritical, and that's not me not remembering, but because I've changed my own perspective. I mean, you have to understand, Mothman and Point Pleasant have been part of my life for 20 years.
Yeah.
We started this process in 2003. Yeah. So, there's 2 decades of research and interviews and working on the documentary film, doing interviews like this with you, with George Norrie on Coast to Coast, and countless other podcasts and television shows. We've done them all, and it was interesting because, like I said, we went in to this. We all had some preconceived ideas. Exactly what I just said a second ago. You shouldn't go in with preconceived ideas. Well, we did. Charlie went in thinking that, there was something that people had seen, didn't really know what it was. But, obviously it was real. Matthew, my cousin, very, very down to earth, very rooted. And he was an environmental science major. And, very, very scientific in his approach to things, also law enforcement. So very down to earth. He was approaching it from an environmental standpoint. The sightings took place, again, in what was called the TNT area. It was called that because they stored trinitrotoluene there. And I hate saying that word, but you know how many times I had to practice saying that for the documentary? Thankfully, I only had to say it once in the documentary, but it took a lot of times to figure out how to say that word properly. But, it was storing that and other chemicals. So Matthew, and that whole process started in the 1940s. So there was a 20-year time period that these chemicals were there. They're still there. But Matthew thought, well, maybe, with the presence of these chemicals over 20 years, maybe what they saw was some type of mutation. And then I went in because my background is a little different. Mine is media and it's journalism. It's to be very objective, but I also grew up in a very, very religious environment. Church 3 times a week. I was educated in a private Christian school. I trained and served as a pastor for a part of my young adult life. Had worked on a master's in divinity with an emphasis in theology. And so I went in with a very, very spiritual, and I will say this, a very, very biased Judeo-Christian perspective, and with red eyes and wings and the height. My initial analysis was, we were dealing with something demonic. We were dealing with a fallen angel or a Nephilim. And I pursued that line of thinking so much that I had partnered with Dr. L.A. Marzulli, who is the author of the Nephilim trilogy, The Watchers. We were really pushing this Nephilim, demonic, evil spirit kind of angle. And then I started presenting at the Mothman Festival. And so to present at the Mothman Festival, I didn't want it to sound like some kind of Sunday sermon, so I began to bring in other documents besides just Judeo-Christianity. I was bringing in Judaism and Islam and Hinduism and Mesoamerica with the Mayans and the Incas and Native American indigenous people and all over the world. And when you start looking at, going back even to Egypt and Assyria and Babylonia and Samaria, you find these winged entities in every single culture on Earth. Every culture has it. We call them angels, we call them demons. And ironically, both of those words mean technically the same thing. It means a messenger. We're projecting onto this what we think is good, bad, evil, holy, unholy, demonic, angelic. Has Mothman ever killed anyone? No, not to my knowledge. No one's ever been killed by one of these winged entities.
Sure.
Have they ever hurt or harmed anyone? Not that I know of. I've never heard a single story of, being abducted, being accosted, having any type of physical harm brought to them. And Lon Strickler, who's a good friend of mine, has Phantoms and Monsters, and has his show. He's got his magazine. He's got all of these outlets where he deals with this. And this, this is what Lon does for a living. He collects these stories. He researches these stories. He compiles all this. He's been following sightings of winged entities in the Chicago area for the better part of a decade. All over the Great Lakes area there. Chicago O'Hare Airport especially seems to be a hotbed right now.
Yeah, it does.
And Lon even, and we will go into it, in detail or in depth, but he has said it publicly on shows where I have been with him. So I don't have a problem in making this one statement, because all you have to do is go back and watch the shows, and you'll hear Lon make the statement. But I'm not about to put any. I'm not going to taint that with any type of perspective or project onto it what I think he's talking about. But Lon has stated that he and his researchers have had intellectual communication with these winged entities.
Right. Yep.
And that, they are here to communicate with us, to guide us. But he also says that there are good entities and there are bad entities. There are those that are wanting to help. There's those that are wanting to harm.
Sure. So
again, that's, you go watch any of Lon's programs where he talks about the winged cryptids, the flying cryptids in Chicago. You'll hear him make these comments, and he warns other people to not try to communicate with them, because they will communicate. But individuals who aren't prepared for that type of communication, that type of knowledge, that type of high strangeness, you can end up doing more harm to yourself than you can good. And I echo that from Lon's perspective. This field is interesting, it's fascinating, but it is dangerous. There are some dangers that come with coming into this field if you are not mentally and emotionally, and yes, to some degree spiritually prepared for some of the things that you're going to encounter and some of the things that you're going to learn, and a lot of the questions that you're going to walk away with, because at the end of the day, there aren't a lot of answers. Those questions just keep multiplying.
Yeah, they do, and that's one takeaway from doing this show for so many years. It's like, man, I thought I had things sorted out pretty well before, but now that I've dove deeper into these rabbit holes, I realize that, I have way, way, way more questions than when I start out. And it's like, the more you know, at least you know what you don't know better, but you still don't know much.
It is. And like I said before, that's one of the things that I love, is that it makes us, first of all, keep asking questions. Mm-hmm. And I think the minute that we as an individual, we as humanity stop asking questions, is the minute we kind of might as well just hang it up. It's kind of like, as the older we get physically, the more active we need to stay. We need to stay mentally active. We need to stay physically active as much as we possibly can, so that we don't, set up atrophy, and we just kind of, our brain mellows, our body mellows, the muscles stop working. So we have to keep moving forward and doing. And I think that's very true also in this field. We have to keep asking questions, because the minute we stop asking questions is the minute we just kind of admit defeat, that we're never going to understand, and that there's no point continuing to try. And I don't think that's the case. I think the fun in this field is the question. It's the ask. It's the curiosity.
Yeah. So now another thing that I think is great, that, and we've talked about it a bit on the last time you were on, but I think it really does help to validate the whole. There's not one Mothman. There's probably many of them, whatever they are. And that is the mentioning of the Chicago sightings and the O'Hare Airport issues and all of the weirdness that's been coming out of there, along with, apparently sightings all over the world, including, and this I mentioned last time too, but Chernobyl, the Minneapolis bridge collapse, and in the Twin Towers, allegedly. And so it really, the question is, at least in some of these cases, you had mentioned, hey, I don't think they've killed anybody, but are there those people that believe that this creature caused the bridge collapse in Point Pleasant?
Yeah, there are. I don't think that group of individuals is as large and as adamant as they once were.
Sure.
But I do believe that they still exist. Going kind of addressing what you're talking about there, if you look at it historically again, these types of sightings have happened throughout history. England had sightings in the late 1800s of an entity that, basically has been termed Springfield Jack.
Right.
1857 to early 1900s, terrifying, frightening creature. It had red glowing eyes, that some eyewitnesses said looked like red balls of fire, and, he was able to leap and bound and attack. Now, that one did supposedly attack people with some scratches and claw marks and things like that. Uh-huh. The general consensus that, at least the last time that I looked into it, most people were thinking that it was probably a kangaroo that had been brought back from Australia and had been gotten loose and was running rapid through the cities of London at the time.
Okay.
Nick Redfern has a great a couple of books where he addresses different types of monsters and cryptids and things like that. He talks about the Houston Batman from Houston, Texas, 1953. He was a very tall man, bat-like wings, encased in a halo of glowing light. But he would, these predate Mothman in Point Pleasant by 15 years.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Native Americans, of course, have the Thunderbird. The Lakota tribe also had, which this one was always one that I was very interested in relation to Mothman, as that was the Walking One, which is Wakinguan, and I'm probably mispronouncing that completely horribly. So if there is anybody from the Lakota tribe that wants to tell me exactly how to pronounce the word, I will be more than happy to rectify that and learn how to say it. But it was that word simply refers to sacred winged flying people that existed in the Lakota tribe.
Sure.
So the Vietnam officers in the 1960s, seeing what they dubbed a pitch black naked female with wings flying over the jungles of Vietnam. So I mean, these sightings have permeated history, and they're fascinating when you start looking at them. And all of the books, like you mentioned, the Twin Towers. There was supposedly a photograph of that. We did examine that photograph. We had two separate computer experts take a look at that photograph. They both ruled it with high probability, not 100%, but they ruled that photograph with high probability of being real. Now, there's some that have said it's a total fake. I'm just saying that the two that we let look at it went on record as saying, the high probability of it being a real creature, a real entity. I had a friend in Somerset, Kentucky, a couple of years ago sent me a photograph of something, and this individual, I've never publicized the photo, although I have been given permission to. I've never publicized it yet.
Okay.
The only people who have seen it are myself, Bill Bean, Kent Baker, Derek Stroman, and Lon Strickler. We all looked at it together on a Zoom call, and but this individual was in Somerset, Kentucky. She was sunbathing with some friends near the lake, and just happened to be taking pictures. And in the sky, she caught a very strange winged entity flying overhead. And the individual is very objective. They are very down to earth. They're very plugged into the community. They're well-known professional, well-known business leader in the community. Knew very little about Mothman. Only thing that they knew about Mothman was that I had worked on the documentary. They didn't really have any previous knowledge about anything, but immediately sent me the picture and wanted to know if I could tell them what it was. And I honestly can't. I can't tell them what it is, but it's a fascinating photograph.
Wow.
But it was in broad daylight, and it's a very interesting photograph of a winged entity flying overhead. We look at this, we hear these stories, and it's kind of like the UAP phenomena right now. We're hearing more and more.
Right.
There was Mothman in Point Pleasant, Chernobyl, the Twin Towers, the Minnesota Bridge collapse. Yeah. And then, we didn't really hear about it. Nothing was talked about. Now you've got, it's like every day I have a notification from Lon that there's been a new sighting going to New Jersey or Chicago or New York or somewhere, overseas. They're becoming more and more prevalent and more.
Yeah.
It's mainstream. And I, Dr. Stephen Greer, who has this wonderful,
sure,
he's got some wonderful documentaries. He's a brilliant individual. He's got this group of individuals doing this mental concentration every day at the same time, and they're trying to communicate with extraterrestrials. And I have not ruled out that all of that mental and psychic energy that all these individuals all over the world are doing at the same time every day has not actually started breaking down the barrier between this plane and the next plane, which is why we have been seeing more and more aerial phenomena, more and more supernatural phenomena, more and more paranormal things that are taking place. And I think it would be fascinating to actually look at the number of sightings when they started doing that, as opposed to the number of sightings of all of these things. There's been more Bigfoot sightings recently. There's been, there's even now, I saw the other day, new sightings of the Loch Ness Monster, and they're now launching a brand new endeavor to examine the Loch Ness to see if they can find something. It's like all of these things that were, at least for me, part of my childhood, Bigfoot and Loch Ness and UFO, are becoming very, very mainstream right now. We're seeing this manifestation of them unfold.
Sure. Like
we've never seen before. And of course, now the government's told us it's all real, and now nobody believes it because the government has said it's real. You just want to say, oh, yes, it's real. Now we don't want to believe it.
Yeah, it's a counterproductive thing. But there's a famous photo, allegedly, of the Point Pleasant Bridge showing what appears to be a winged individual or humanoid. Have you examined that, or has it been professionally really examined? And is that potentially a real photograph as well?
We looked at it. We let our two computer individuals look at it as well. Mm-hmm. Again, high probability of it being legitimate, but also almost as high probability. So almost a 50-50 chance that it was faked.
Okay.
And I had somebody send me today, as a matter of fact, a supposed video. Actually, it was supposed to be a still photograph captured by a drone of a winged, red-eye, horned entity standing shrouded in fog.
Oh, okay.
This was supposed to have been captured by a drone. And I sent a message back just, thanking the individual, somebody that I know. And it was a compilation of this drone footage that was supposedly captured. And I thanked her for sending it. I found it very interesting. The problem is I saw that same image probably 6 or 7 years ago. At that point in time, it was being circulated as having been taken by a bystander with their cell phone. So it's, it's one of those things you get, and, right now with the permeation of AI technology and being able to create very, very lifelike, realistic images, I am even more of a skeptic about anything that anyone puts in front of me, whether it's a photograph, whether it's an audio recording, whether it's a video recording. I have become very, very skeptical. As a matter of fact, I'm glad you contacted me today, because if you contacted me a couple of days sooner, I would have said, "Man, I can't do the show," because I actually have been working on a final paper for one of my classes on my master's degree. As I mentioned, I had the strokes in March, so I had to take an incomplete in one class, so I had to finish that before classes began on the 28th. So I finished a paper. My paper was on basically the ethical dilemma that the media field in general is facing with artificial intelligence, ChatGPT, and being able to dictate to a computer to create what we want to see, and it creates that for us.
Yeah.
And I think that really I didn't bring the supernatural and the paranormal and the Freudian field into it because I really wanted to pass the paper. Didn't want to get failed.
Sure.
But in reality, I think that's something that this field is going to have to really take a look at.
Yeah.
When we start getting submissions from individuals saying they've seen this, they've experienced this, that level of skepticism is going to have to go up several notches, and it is nothing against the individual submitting it, not saying that they did fake it, not saying that they did create it, but saying that right now the technology is so readily accessible for anyone to do that.
Right.
You have to assume that that's a possibility.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was a great example of that just recently with a bunch of Bigfoot photos that are basically in the sepia tone. They're look like old-timey photos where these Bigfoot are 15 feet tall and standing next to some bearded old-fashioned guy from the 1800s.
Old-timey.
Yeah, and it's like they just came out of nowhere, and everybody's like, whoa. And there was no backstory. And then about a month later, some backstory emerged where, they were found in a jar in a backyard in Kentucky.
Yes.
And it's like,
Kentucky.
Yeah. So I'm like, no. And so basically I think that was all shut down pretty quick, but they were all over the place suddenly.
But they got what they wanted, which they got it circulated. They got talking, and again, that's kind of a concern. I will say this: after having spent many years in the state of Kentucky, and I love the state. It has been better to me than other states. But I will say this: the reason that I find that hard to believe is because in Kentucky we had better uses for empty mason jars than putting fake photographs and burying them in the yard. There's a lot better uses of those jars. Just saying.
Yeah, absolutely. You should be able to drink it, by God, if you dig it up, right?
Exactly.
Wow.
But yeah, I mean, but seriously, and very legitimately, I think that individuals who are in this field, that is going to become very, very problematic.
Yeah.
Looking at how these deep fake type of hoaxes are going to start manifesting and popping up. And like you said, it's Bigfoot, it's going to be the giants, the Nephilim, it's going to be extraterrestrials, it's going to be Mothman,
ghosts,
it's going to be ghosts, Loch Ness Monster, you name it.
Yeah.
And we're going to be, this stuff is going to start floating around. So we're going to have to be even more vigilant than we've been in the past, because this field, this area of research is always under scrutiny. It's always kind of the bastard of any type of science or anything like that. Nobody really gives it any respect,
right?
And so we have to be on our guard. We really do. We have to say, I see what you're showing me, but I need to see more.
Right.
I need to know the main story.
Yeah. No, exactly.
Break it down like that.
But you're right. I think that is going to be a liability moving forward. But hopefully, what it'll end up doing is causing people to be a little more skeptical on the front end. Because I think whenever anything is presented as evidence, you have to look at it through the eyes of a skeptic first, and then if it passes muster and you have a story that makes sense, then start digging. But if it comes in and it's just like, I use the term orgy of evidence. It's used in homicide a lot for used in investigations for like setup crimes. They were staged, and it's like it is very much the same for this kind of stuff. It's like, well, this stuff is very elusive and very, very rare. And all of a sudden, there's 50 black and white photos that are just cured. It's like, wait a minute, that doesn't even the math is all wrong for me.
Yes. Well, that was, when it comes to Mothman especially, and of course, if there are current sightings, I get there's a change with technology and it's easier to take photographs. But that was, for looking at the Mothman in Point Pleasant and just going back to that impetus of this whole story and the historical side of it, there were no photographs of Mothman at the time. There was no video footage, no home video footage, nothing. All that you had were eyewitness reports. It was the police reports that they were making when they saw these things. It was them talking about it, talking to John Keel. And so it became very, very difficult to say, as you said, the reconciling what this entity was, what it actually looked like, how it actually behaved, because you had varying verbal accounts and not one piece of physical evidence. The closest thing that was ever found that would be considered evidence was the scratch marks on Roger Scarberry's car, and there was a tree outside the home of a young girl in Point Pleasant who had seen the Mothman standing outside by the tree, leaning against it, supposedly with his hand up on the tree, and then he flew off, but he had, in flying off, it kind of scratched down the tree, so there were these marks about 9 feet up on the tree, and these scratch marks coming down that could possibly have been, fingernail marks, claw marks, something like that. But other than that, there was really no physical evidence of the sightings of Mothman.
Well, it makes for compelling research, that's for sure.
It does. Yeah. It does. It makes it for challenging research too, to go back and look at those original sightings.
When did that photo of the bridge with the Mothman on it appear, or because that wasn't circulated much at the time? It was much after the fact that came out, or what was it?
It was, and what I'm going to say, I don't know the date that started circulating because I don't want to misquote. What I will do is go back through my notes because I know it's somewhere, but I don't know when that photograph started originating. I know when it comes to the collapse of the bridge, again, there were individuals that the eyewitnesses did claim seeing that. Eyewitnesses also claimed the day before they saw several men dressed in dark suits with fedoras and sunglasses underneath the bridge. So that has also led to the speculation that the men in black had something to do with the collapse of the Silver Bridge.
Oh.
So there's no lack of conspiracy theories when it comes to collapse of the bridge.
Well, to any of this, really, yeah. I mean, not only the Mothman, but to everything. There's there's 15 layers of intrigue, and then there's the actual event.
Exactly. Now, I will tell you, and I really haven't discussed this on any interview, but I thought it would be fun to toss out there on yours.
Sure. Thank you.
And see if it could get some topics going and get some discussion. I mentioned the Native American tie and the indigenous tribe, or tie with Chief Cornstalk and his son, Elenipsico.
Uh-huh.
There's a third member of the Cornstalk family most people don't talk about, and that is Cornstalk's sister. Her name was Nonhalema, Nonhelema. She was an almost 7-foot-tall warrior chiefess.
Oh, wow.
She died in 1786, but her name, Nonhalema, literally translates into not a man.
Oh.
Now, my, Native American tribes have a long history of being matriarchal many times. They have a very strong acceptance and respect of the female power and spirit. I've often wondered if the curse that Cornstalk put on the area for it to never find peace, if this 7 to 9 foot tall winged entity might not be some type of spiritual manifestation of Nonhalema.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, that would only apply to the winged sightings in Point Pleasant.
Sure.
That doesn't take into account these other ones. I've often wondered about that. and again, it's not something that could be proven. It's not something that, but it makes for a very interesting story.
Yeah, it does. It really does.
It makes for an interesting theory.
Wow. Yeah, that boggles my imagination, but you're right. I mean, what if? And the beauty of this is, and this is true for any topic, and I say this on my live shows all the time, it's like, look, there's no wrong answers because we don't know what the right answers are. So any theory or idea is just as valid as any other one. But that's pretty compelling.
It's interesting at the very least. I mean, I think it's one of those, it's a good conversation sitting around, with some, salami, some cheese, and some wine, and actually discussing it, and and walking down, what could this mean for Point Pleasant? What could this mean with this tie to the indigenous tribes and things like that? It makes for a very interesting story.
Yeah.
And I agree with you. The only wrong answer in anything is when we decide we have the only answer. That's the only time that we've reached the wrong conclusion, and this is the way it has to be.
Right.
Well, no, because that's just not the way it works. Not in life in general, and especially not in this field.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's been another incredible journey with you, brother, and I'm so glad you came back on and made this work for us today. That was incredible.
My pleasure. Like I've said, anytime that you need me, there's still a lot more stuff that we haven't even, really scratched the surface of. I will say that, when we did the original edit of the documentary film, it was over 4 hours long. That's how much information we had that we had come up with. And we kept editing it down because of what I told Charlie McCracken was, we are not Peter Jackson. No one is going to sit through a 4.5 hour documentary on Mothman.
Well, you throw in some
Lord of the Rings.
Throw in some elves and some hobbits, and you might have a deal there. Could be a Nazgul.
We've got to get this down to a manageable edit, and that's actually what we decided. And this is still in the works. Trying to do different episodes of the documentary for each theory, each thing that we were coming up with, just continuing to pound away at that, and trying to visit as many sighting locations as we could, interview as many eyewitnesses as we could, and start building this. Thus, the Mothman Chronicles, it was supposed to have multiple episodes and things like that. So, but it was great to be with you. Looking forward to coming back. You just, as always, let me know, and I'll make it happen, sir.
And you sure did. So thank you very much, and it's always a pleasure, sir, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.
Thank you. You as well. And I will be talking to you very soon.
Very good. All right, everybody, that's going to wrap it up for us today. So hope you guys enjoyed the show, and thank you again so much for all your love and support. Remember, if you want to follow the Paranormal Portal, probably the easiest way is to head over to paranormalportal.net, and that's the homepage for the Paranormal Portal, and you'll find links to all of our different social media and sites and information about the shows, including our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/Paranormal Portal, or just look for Paranormal Portal on Google or whatever search engine, and you'll find links to our social media such as Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. So we're kind of all over the place, and we're spreading as well as we can. But anyway, thank you so much for the love and support. Y'all take care, and remember, we love y'all. Be good, be kind, be nice. Take care of each other, help each other out, find the magic in every day, and remember to laugh as much as you can. Until next time.
Well, the only time she really turned with that famous was when I rode across the creek and got down off the horse. She turned to look at me.